your like all the events? You only have one or two.
Yeah, I'm doing SmackDowns again, November 17th.
November 17th. I'll mark it in my calendar. I don't know if I'll be able to make that one, but we'll get together again.
The revival.
When I got the email last week, about 2 weeks ago, I was super stoked.
Yeah, my class. We didn't have all the details down yet for that email, but there's another email's coming out for that.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Cool.
All right. And you guys can all see the slides. You can hear Robin just fine.
Can everyone see the blended Scotch whiskey slide? Yeah, okay.
All right.
Just so you know, you're not at the single malt tasting. You know, that's important. I don't want you to be confused.
I'm warming up with some teaspoon malt. So.
There you go. Is that the
probably the wrong thing to warm up with since it's peated? But,
the Burnside?
No, it's a teaspoon Ardbeg from it's a what do you call it? A Duncan Taylor octave.
Yeah. So my guys at the Perfect Fifth are releasing a teaspoon of Balvenie. We're calling it Two Sisters. So it's Balvenie, obviously, in Glenfiddich. I think it's a 34-year-old Balvenie.
Nice.
Hey, Harold. Thank you for joining.
Good to see you again.
We meet more here in virtual world than in person. Same for Olaf. All right. Let's see. Right. Okay, so I will catch the other people that are joining. I will catch them up as we go and manage the chat and make sure that everyone has the lineup. I'll put it in there once more. So this is the lineup in the chat. You can go ahead and pour. Some of these have been in glass for a really long time, and you may want to pour it earlier, put a cover on it, or even just let it breathe. That's solely up to you. As we go through these, you might want to pour the next one and let it wait. It's a little bit different than some other tastings we do where we just kind of like pour one at a time and kind of go. So use that at your discretion, however you would like to do that. And Robin, of course, if you have any recommendations for anyone as we go, by all means, please let us know.
With something like this, with with blended Scotch whiskeys, okay, so everybody knows that I use a neat glass, but it's a pretty wide open glass. I mean, something like this, because we should drink them the way they were supposed to be drunk back then, and they were drunk very casually. So if you wanted to put this just in a regular tumbler, or a rocks glass, it would be fine. You want to, you got a chunk of ice in there, why not?
A boot, a wine glass, anything you got, as long as it's.
There you go.
All right, so let's get started. We'll go around and just say hello first. Where you're calling in from, if you can share that. And then anything you would want to share. Maybe there's a whiskey, one of the drams that really caught your eye that you're really interested in trying. Or maybe there's something that really draws you to blends tastings. Blends tastings are not the sexiest tastings. Not always, sometimes, but they're not always the sexiest tastings. But if you can really, really find and develop the palate for it and really learn about the history about how that paved the way for Scotch, it really makes it into a really, really intriguing tasting. And that's what we wanted to do tonight. But Josh and Serena, do you want to say hello first?
Sure. Hi. I'm Serena. This is Josh. And I don't know, Josh, say something about whiskey.
It's clear. And, no, I am a old blends collector and lover. I do like a lot of sort of, middle shelf 1970s blends, that sort of thing. One of my favorites, though, is actually the what's it called? The King's Ransom Around the World. That's a fun one. It's been around from at least the 30s or 40s, I think. Most of my bottles are from the 50s and 60s. That's a lot of fun. Just a ton of sherried Edgedour in there. Robin knows I have a love for the 1970s sherried Cutty Sark 12 year. That's a fun bottle. But yeah. And then I also have a thing for Harvey's Thin Red Line from the 70s, which makes just really spectacular highballs. It's just I consider a really great summer whiskey. It's just really light and makes really great highballs.
Very nice. Very nice. There, we do plan on doing a Cutty Sark tasting in the future. And I just got a King's Ransom. I don't know which one though. There's like a lot of different versions. It's a square bottle.
Yeah, it's square with netting, and it's been made. It was made for a while. I forget if it's still actually being made. It's quite different, obviously, than it is. But yeah, it's just a sherry bomb.
Nice. Well, excited to have you both. Thank you for joining. Olaf.
Hello, everyone. My name is Olaf, calling in from Lower East Side, Manhattan. I drink primarily single malts, but love to dabble in blends once in a while, especially old blends as well. I think me and James had a lot of discussion on what the lineup was going to be tonight. I've had a lot of ideas, I think, back and forth, but I'm excited to try these 6.
Yeah, and Olaf and I have been drinking blends for a really long time, and we talked about doing this for quite a while, so looking forward to it as well. One of our good friends, Bill Myers, is having technical difficulties, so he'll be joining all of us in a second. The next, Jim Albright. Jim.
Yep, so I'm calling in from the beautiful Garden State of New Jersey, and I got a thumbs up from Robin there, my neighbor to the north. And I'm a huge fan of all whiskeys, and I just picked up a bottle of Sierra Norte today from Mexico that I'm eager to try. You owe it to yourself to explore and try new things, and I get a kick out of the people that say, "Oh, I only drink single malt," because they keep the blends affordable for those of us who know better. And I think back in the time when a lot of these were made, it was the thing, and then single malt kind of took over. But worldwide, blended scotches still outsell single malt by a wide margin, and I think they're starting to make a comeback too. Especially, I'm a big fan of a lot of the stuff that Stephanie McLeod is doing at Dewar's with the double series and the cask finish series. So I think we're poised to see blends start to make a resurgence and start to earn respect again. So I'm really excited to try some of these, historical and vintage drams with you guys.
Agreed, Jim. Agreed. That's going to be really fun. And sometimes blends in the single malt world, they get a bad rap sometimes. And I think that's what tastings like tonight will hope to not only disprove, but just show the really bright side of blends as well. And
yeah, I think especially in the U.S., because the term blended whiskey, in the CRF from 1964, blended whiskey kind of became a catch-all for the garbage, for the stuff that didn't meet the bourbon requirements or the rye whiskey requirements. And the word blend got a bad name in the US. And it's just, if you think about it, all whiskey is blended unless it's a single barrel. Somewhere in that production line, there's a blender, or even a single malt. There's somebody who's making that bottle of Macallan 12 tastes like the last bottle of Macallan 12.
Yep.
So blending is an art form, and an underappreciated one at that.
Yep, 100%. All right, looking forward to getting into this. I agree with a lot of what you said, because I think with blends, it takes an extra added care to get it right versus a single cast is a single cast. So we'll definitely get into all of that. Mark Mason.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark from Staten Island, New York. I've just been a lover of whiskey for a very, very long time. And February 13, 2019, I took my first class with Robin at Astor Wine center, and he just really changed the way I thought about whiskey and just any opportunity to really just explore. And I think over the pandemic, where I got to do a lot more virtual tastings and stuff like that, where I never thought I was a Scotch guy, I've really become, my palate's really evolved, and I really enjoy it, especially blends, because there's just such an art to it.
Thanks, Mark. That's perfect. I saw Anthony and Bill join, so we're just doing a quick round of introductions before we get started. Barbara and I think Andy, right? Are you both there? You want to say hello?
Yeah, Barbara and Adam.
Adam.
We just moved to Maryland from New York. And we haven't done a tasting in a long time, so we're excited to try these blends.
Yeah.
Awesome. Adam, Barbara, thank you for joining. It'll be really fun. Next, Harold.
What's going on, guys? A lot of familiar faces, including about half of the Port Lawrence Super Bowl party is in this group.
Oh yeah,
that was a fun time. I'm sort of like the newish whiskey drinker, I guess, in the group. It's only been a few years for me, and naturally, when I started drinking, it was all single malt, Glenlivet, Macallan, whatever was on a bar or easily accessible. But I've always had respect for blends, especially the more I got into it, more of what James Albright was saying. You know, you got to respect the past, and I feel like the blends tell the story of whiskey in more ways than one, and it's going to be a fun tasting. And anytime Robin's talking about whiskey is always educational, so I'm always signing up for that.
Yep, there's a lot of good stories here. It's not just about the tasting. It's gonna be a fun night. Anthony, if you we're going around just if you want to say hello, where you're calling in from, anything you wanted to add. If you saw, and Bill too, if you saw a dram tonight that really caught your eye and you're really looking forward to, or maybe there's a good story about a blend, anything that really just helps us understand where you're at right now.
Sure. No, yeah, this was, I caught this kind of randomly because I am doing my best to not live my life on Facebook as much as I used to. And just went on one day and randomly kind of saw this and was like, oh, Robin Robinson, the general. I was like, okay, I definitely have to do this. So yeah, I've been wanting to try the general for a long, long time. And as other people have said, listening to Robin is not.
Are you froze there for a second.
Listening to he said listening to Robin makes you freeze.
So Anthony signed off. No, he'll come back here in a second. I think he just froze. Bill Myers. Bill, you got it? All good?
I need some scotch. I'm not used to this browser thing and just frustrating with passwords and whatnot. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to this. I didn't even know this Hallmark blend existed.
Excited, I think.
I've got several Hallmarks. I've got an Alberfeldy, Craigellachie, Glendulin, Glen Grant, and Longmorn, and a Manickmore, and a couple of rums, and then an Armagnac. So, and everything's been solid. So I'm really excited by that.
Awesome. Yeah, the more research I did on it as well, and talking with Robin, really cool story. I don't know all the details of that company, but it's really interesting. So we'll dive into that as well. Anthony, you kind of froze. Did you want to say anything else before we get started?
No, just happy to be here. Stuck at work. Right. Have my samples are at home, so I'm gonna listen and then go taste later. So I'm gonna keep my camera off because internet is not good in the office. But looking forward to it either way.
Got it. All right, well, let's get started. This is being recorded, but that's okay. Like, I don't think anybody watches it. The only people that missed it. So, say whatever you want. Speak your mind. The lineup I put in the chat. I'll put it once again so you have it. I mentioned it earlier. Some of these have been in glass for a really long time. If you want to let it breathe in the glass, go for it. It's completely up to you. This is an exciting tasting. We do tastings. I've been doing them maybe like 2 a month, 3 a month for a while. And this was one that I've been looking forward to doing for a long time. And Robin, you and I saw each other recently, and we just, had typical drinks and cigars and all that. But it was in my mind, I was like, wait, I need to find someone that not only knows about these particular whiskeys, but can also kind of bring us on a journey of what they really represent. And the specificity of this tasting was that it's blends old and new, meaning that there's some blends that are forgotten. They've been in glass for a long time. People don't know that they really exist anymore. And then there's some newer ones, some new modern blends. And even Jim was talking a little bit ago about what is a blend. Kind of almost everything's a blend these days. And so we'll uncover a lot of those different stories. But Robin has been so gracious to host us, and he's prepared some slides, and I'm sure that he'll share just the greatest knowledge of his background and his enjoyment of all things whiskey. Robin used to work at one of these, so you stay tuned. He'll tell you that whole story. And his book, The Complete Whiskey Course, is out. If you haven't seen it, read it, buy it. And I just love the way, Robin, that you've been able to talk about spirits. If you remember, like the award ceremony that you went to down South America, and just the way you described your approach to whiskey. It's not just, oh, here's another whiskey that we're going to drink and enjoy. There's a lot of work that goes into it. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of families. There's a lot of history that goes into these. Even something you buy off the store shelves today. And so to be able to take whiskeys like this and then really kind of have us all walk away at the end of the night with, wow, knowing that story makes me appreciate and kind of taste that whiskey in a slightly different way. That's what I always like, the way you talk about whiskey and the stories that you tell, and your history coming from the tech industry and then into whiskey, and then just, all the other things that you've done since then. So thank you, Robin, for hosting. We're all excited. We're all attentive. So thank you very much for hosting. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thanks, James. Hey, everybody. Good to see everyone again. And yeah, James, like was mentioned here, last time we saw each other, I think, was at the Super Bowl party there. So at Matt Lauren's place. And I'm surprised. I thought Matt was going to be on this as well, but he's probably coming in later.
He has. No, I saw you at Matt's recently, last month, I think. Remember, we got together for Yankees. Yeah. Oh, something. I don't know.
It was a sporting event. I remember that. Yeah. Well, so I think Jim Albright really kind of nailed it here. About the whole idea about blends and where they actually stand in the history of drinking. I've always look, when I the first Scotch whiskey I had was 13 years old. It was actually quite by accident. I was invited to perform at my church's New Year's Eve party because I was a class clown and I told jokes. And I guess everyone thought, hey, let's let the kid tell some jokes before midnight. That'll be fun. So I go to this thing, and some guy's Cutty Sark was sitting right next to my ginger ale. And I came off the stage, and my throat was parched, and I took an enormous gulp of this guy's Cutty Sark. And it was an experience I'll never forget. And although I wanted to for a long time. The next time I encountered blended Scotch whiskeys was in the heyday of the 70s, and I was out there being a young adult. And I remember I was at a bar in Houston, Texas, and the bartender had this one had this one bottle that sat on the bar, and if you poked it, it rocked back and forth. And so everybody remember what that is, right? If you poked it, it rocked back and forth.
That would be the swing, right?
JW swing, exactly, yeah. So Johnny Walker swing, and I just was drinking a martini, and I was poking the bottle, and finally the guy said, hey, listen, man, you can't keep poking my bottle unless you want to have some. I said, yeah, I'll have some. And I tasted it, and it was actually, I said, wow, this is actually really good. And that was actually at the time when Chivas was considered the luxury brand of the 1970s. And if you went to discos, you were actually, that sort of marked you as a different type of a person by drinking Chivas Brothers blended Scotch. And so it all went away and then I got involved in single malts, and I got to be very much like everyone else starts out as a real snob about single malts. I don't want to taste anything else. I started a whiskey club here back in the early 2000s, and we all just did single malt tastings. And then a friend of mine gave me a bottle of Compass Box Asila, and I got my mind blown. I'd never tasted anything like that in my life, especially for a blended Scotch whiskey. I had no idea it could be so luscious and had such finesse and so delicate, and yet and still really delivered. And so I got turned around by that, and it was I think it was about 3 years later. It was actually when I started working with Compass Box. So obviously I'm a fan of blends, and they fit historically, So just to kind of give everybody an idea, when I talk about Scotch whiskey with people, I tell them it's three numbers to remember: 2, 5, and 3, right? So it's you got two types of whiskey that are made in Scotland. One is a malt whiskey, and that's done in a pot still and 100% malted barley. And then the other one is the grain whiskeys, and grain whiskeys are like the great ignored whiskey of Scotland. They're made in these massive columns, and they're typically abused when they're in the warehouse. They're put in sometimes third, fourth, fifth fill of casks, and they're not really cared for very well. And yet they make up an enormous amount of what the whiskey is, especially when you look at what whiskeys used to be and what whiskeys are now. So if you're looking at pre-1960s whiskeys, which is primarily what we're going to be drinking here, 1960s and early 1970s, the big difference in here was really the ratio of malt to grain. So grain whiskey was typically at 50% or below. Sometimes, some of the real high-end blends were down to 30% grain whiskey. And what does the grain whiskey do? It acts as a bed, in which allows the malts to really kind of flourish. And the way that I often describe blended whiskeys to people who've never had one before is that think of it from a painter's perspective. If you've got a bunch of different colors and you want to actually expand that color palette to actually some nuance of color, what do? But you add in white. You add in white, and that takes that red down to a type of a less intense red, and that allows you to paint something that you wouldn't have been able to do with the red. And the same thing with the blue, and it mixes colors as well. And that's exactly how grain whiskey is used in blended Scotch whiskeys. It's used as a bed in which to layer on these really very, very characteristic malt whiskeys, and use it to actually sort of be the white inside of all of these different colors to create this whole new rainbow. The good news and the bad news is that it's the amount of grain whiskey that really determines the quality of the blend. And what we were seeing before in pre-1960s is that most of the blended Scotch whiskeys had at the very most 50% grain whiskey, and then the rest of it would be a blend of malt. And the bad news is what happened after that, because as everyone may know, that is what is known in Scotland as the whiskey lock. And the reason there was a whiskey lock was because there were no orders coming in for blended Scotch whiskey. Blended Scotch whiskey was starting to be supplanted in the marketplace of these new bunch of people who grew up called the boomers, and they were turning away from what their fathers and grandfathers drank and started looking for lighter spirits like vodka and gin and a lot of California wine, which was growing at that time. And so as a result, the blended Scotch whiskey makers started shutting down malt distilleries. You had a lot of, the DCL and the UDV and all of these different types of collaborations and consolidations that were happening in Scotland. And at the same time, they were increasing the amount of grain whiskeys that were being used in any particular blend. Not only that, but they weren't waiting for the grain whiskeys to last very long, and so they would take them out at 3 years and then use them in the blend. And so blended Scotch whiskey really started to take a real shot in the arm.
And Robin,
yeah.
Well, on that note, I mean, there's this is going to be a theme that I think comes back again and again in this tasting, because in the old days there's all sorts of tricks and tactics to deliver the final product, whether that was saving costs or integrating other materials you might have. But transparency is a new common thing, right? With all, like, even the newer ones that we try, you can see everything that's in it. And
well, the transparency was not an issue. It was not a thing. I mean, nobody cared because you bought the quality of the name on the label. So you were a doer's man. You were a Chivas man. I was a Cuddy man. This is a Cuddy family. So yeah, it didn't really matter. It's kind of like, you didn't really care about the parts in your Ford as long as it looked great and ran well. And it was the same thing with your Scotch whiskeys. Transparency, definitely not a thing. And the other thing that they were doing, and I'll tell you what, let's actually just go into the first one, and I can go on about this in a second. So we'll go into the Isle of Skye. This is an 18-year blended Scotch. Now, there's not a whole lot of information about this out there. This particular bottle was bottled in the 1970s. We know that Ian MacLeod, who has been around for a long time, is one of the top blenders in Scotland, one of the top blending houses in Scotland. And probably around this time at 18 years, they were probably doing some chill filtering here. They're probably certainly using some caramel color in here. That was a very, very big thing that the 20th century was all about. Chill filtering caramel color, especially at 43%, which is what this is bottled at. So, but it's got a really lush nose. There's a lot of really nice fruits on this. I saw a couple things pop up here. What are people thinking about just the nose and the mouth on this? Nobody, no comment?
very fresh. I'll tell everybody this is a screw cap, metal screw cap, and when I got it, it was full, so it was preserved very well. Bottles in great, no box.
There's nothing metallic in this at all. This is really, really, the nose on this is incredibly lush.
Was this the metal? Okay, so this is not the one that's shown in the picture, because that's got a plastic screw.
Slightly different. You know what's interesting is that it also says private stock number 45. There were various different numbers. I noticed this as well. This one on the screen, I think, came out after the metal cap with the plastic, but it said the same batch number. So we don't know if there is maybe a big vat and then they just saved it and then put it back. But,
those plastic caps are more typical of early 80s.
I just went up and just grabbed whatever kind of shots I can get off the internet in order to put them on a slide. But James has the actual bottle there, which is a metal screw cap.
The fill level, the fill level matched this one, so you could see that it was actually really full.
James, did you get this off Whisky Auctioneer? Because I see one on Whisky Auctioneer from a prior auction that looks sort of identical to what you're describing, and this.
I got this years ago. It was at auction. I don't know which one. I would have to check. But I can find out.
What's really lovely about this is it's a very rich dram. It's got a sort of I got a quick fall off at the finish. But again, these were blended specifically to fall off. They were not really meant. You got to remember the way that people drank these. People drank these as a sociable, type of an occasion. They were drunk with water, with soda water. In the United States, Scotch and soda, is almost a key phrase of the mid 1900s, mid 20th century. But just very nice, just very, very pretty, and for 43% too, it's not bad.
Yeah, it shows really nicely.
Obviously, we know that what's the centerpiece of this, right? It's got to be Talisker. How much Talisker is in there, we don't know, right? but this actually tastes as if it's got pretty close to like a 50-50 blend here. You know, grain whiskey, when you start tasting, when it starts to dominate a blend, you're going to get a brittleness sometimes on the palate and on the finish, but no brittleness right here. You know, this does a nice job of kind of like being the white for all of these different, you know, all of these different colors there. My guess is like with Ian McLeod, you know, they because they did small batches. I don't think that they use more than 5 or 6 different malts in here. Very, very different than how Brewers did theirs. You know, 33 different whiskeys that were used in theirs. I think they were, you know, somewhere in a handful. Obviously, with Talisker leading the way. It's funny, as I talk and as I've got air going through my mouth, I'm picking up Talisker on the finish on this. So it's kind of like, you know, presenting itself, you know, at the very end here. So,
Robin, one thing that I've actually never thought about is, did most of the blenders use a single, just one grain, or do they also use a variety of grains in the blend typically?
Grain whiskeys were commodity whiskeys, you know, and again, it all depends now where you're talking or where in time you're talking. So think about this. Grain whiskeys, obviously the whole idea of a grain whiskey is to make something fast and cheap and of variable proof strength, right? And so you're using commodity grain. We know that up until the 1960s, that the primary grain back then was used was corn. And the only grain distillery now that exclusively uses corn is the one that's in the Highlands that's owned by
Invergordon.
Invergordon, thank you. Yeah, Invergordon's the only one that uses exclusively 100% corn in their grain mash bill. Everybody else had gone to wheat, right? So wheat's a little bit lighter, it's a little bit fruitier. So, but yeah, I mean, you buy corn on the commodities market. It's very much like the big bourbon makers in Kentucky. You're buying dent corn on the commodity market. So, you know, you're buying from Dumbarton, you're buying from, you know, what was left of Cambus. You had the old Caledonian distillery that was still open. Cambus was still open. You know, we've now got what? I think we're down to 8 grain distilleries now, you know. So yeah, so they would use a lot. What was interesting though is in the blender's profile is the fingerprint was really malt. The fingerprint was malt. So they would, for example, the fingerprint of this obviously is Talisker. So they would use Talisker as the fingerprint, and then they would build the character of the blend around that, and then integrate the grain whiskey to get it to, you know, the finesse that they were looking for. Here's just a list of like a lot of people that you may be familiar with. You know, these are independent bottlers that are out there right now. And it was interesting thing about every one of these was an independent bottler. Every one of these was, you know, was that sort of middle tier of Scotch whiskey economics. In the very beginning, you had just Highlanders up there making malt whiskey, and then they would try to get those malt whiskeys down to market, and they would use independent guys who would pick up, you know, would have orders with the Scotch malt whiskey distilleries, and then they would be responsible for getting that down into market. And the market was Glasgow and Edinburgh, where the routes of transportation were, and that happened to be where all the blenders were at as well. And so, you know, in the very beginning, they were bonders. You know, you hear bonding a lot more in Ireland than you do in Scotland, but they still were the middlemen, part of that. And they were responsible for actually getting that whiskey from the Highlands down into the lowlands to sell to the blenders down there. And a lot of them, you know, like for example, you know, Gordon MacPhail, there were grocers. Douglas Lang, and Ainsley's that we're going to be tasting here in a while. I mean, all of these guys were like all middlemen that were, that were part of this chain. And the middlemen now have actually just all gone into business for themselves. So that's like, for example, Gordon MacPhail and Samaroli and Signatory and Scotts and Berry Brothers. Their business now is their brand and their ability to actually source whiskeys as specific barrels, right? It's really when you get into the blenders on the right-hand side, as you can see, there's some duplication here because Douglas Lang is an independent bottler. They're also a blender, right? So is Gordon MacPhail. So is Ian McLeod. Weems. I don't know if anybody remembers a guy named the Wild Scotsman. Anybody remember him? He was from Ohio, and he was doing blended malts. He's been off the market for a long time now. But eventually, when you're holding on to this much whiskey, eventually you're going to start getting curious about what would happen if I put these two together. And so someone put a drop of water in this, and so what happened there? Somebody got a little pedia? Is that what I just read there?
I just put a little drop of water in mine, and I found the peat, and I find peat is distinctive from place to place, from distillery to distillery, and the peat in this is definitely very Talisker. I find a drop or two of water tones the peat down a little bit, and it allows some of that grain in the blend and some of those cereal notes to come to the forefront a little more.
Yeah, that's sweet. Yeah, I love water with whiskey. It's like one of the, when I'm doing my classes, it's the first thing everybody learns. Have a dropper, use some water. Water's your friend. So these were like the guys right here, right? That really kind of started the entire thing. Andrew Usher, Andrew Teacher, John Dewar, but then it was really his son Tommy Dewar that really kind of turned whiskey from Scotland into Scotch whiskey, turned it into actually a signifier of place by putting that Highlander on that label there. The Hagues, which are some of the oldest families of the Hagues, actually go back to the Norman invasion of 1066, the Battle of Hastings, and Robert Stein, who invented the first column still that was used for whiskey, was actually a member of the Hague family. And then you've got James Buchanan down here as well, whose name lives on to this day, and obviously Johnny Walker up on the top. So these guys, some of them were merchants, some of them were grocers. Each one of them was trying to create something that somebody would buy. And when you think about that, that was the beginning of Japanese whiskey as well. Shinjiro Tori had a shoten. He had an import store, and he would import whiskeys and wines, and he would make things that would please his customers' palates. That's all these guys were doing. Blended Scotch whiskey, like Jim mentioned before. This is the standard bearer of the entire Scotch whiskey industry. I heard recently it was at 95%. It's dropped down to about 92% of all the whiskey that comes out of Scotland in the form of a bottle comes out as a blended Scotch whiskey. So it's certainly still the hallmark of the entire industry. I don't know if I hope we're not rushing anybody here, but check out.
I think perfect timing.
Here's my water bottle here. Anybody guess where that's from?
Maury.
OP, very good, nicely done, Old Pulteney. Okay, there's there's the boil ball on the Old Pulteney.
As everyone pours the Hallmark, Robin, there's this, because this is fitting with the previous slide and this slide with this whiskey that we're about to try. because I think this whiskey, I haven't tried any of these. I barely sipped it when I poured just to make sure they weren't, rancid or whatever. But I think this one's going to be good. The last slide you talked about all these old brands or whatnot, and really in any industry, but especially in Scotch, the truth is always, if you put something really, really good in the bottle, there's nothing better you can do to build your brand than doing that, because people will always come back and buy that thing, a doer's man, whatever. But sometimes, even if you put really excellent things in a bottle, things still might not go your way with all the different challenges, all the trials that the Scotch and the whiskey industry have had. No more than this Scotch that's coming up. So it's a fitting slide and a fitting segue to this one.
Yeah, and so you got actually something really. So for example, a Hallmark of St. James. Of course, anybody know when they closed? Anybody familiar with Bill?
So their website went dark in 2006, and I assume that was related.
Okay.
Bill,
most of the things I have were bottled in 2000. So
yeah. Okay, so I mean, they were around for a very, very short amount of time, but you know what? They picked the wrong fucking address. You know why? You know where they put their shop? On St. James. Who else is on St. James? It's Berry Brothers and Rudd. It's kind of like, are you kidding me? It's kind of like Lowe's opening up next to a Home Depot. Why would you do that? So, but I'm sure there were other reasons why, that the shop didn't last that long. But like Bill can attest to, they did some righteous bottlings of single malts. And the cool thing is, they started to vat malts back then too. Now this is 2009 was when the new regulations for the SWA. Yeah, there you go, 71 Longmore, nice. Yeah. 2009 when the regulations for the SWA actually prohibited the use of anything else other than blended malt for this category. So when you take one malt and add it to another malt or more than one malt in no grain whiskey, then you used to have a vatted malt. And that was an old industry term that has been around. Yep, there's a Johnny Walker, the old pure malt there, right. Yeah, the last of the 15, yeah. And of course, one of the reasons that the pure malt was actually, and one of the reasons for the change in regulations is because Diageo had tried to slip in another whiskey with Cardew because they were running short for their key malts for Johnny Walker, and they tried to pass it off as what they called a pure malt. That's when the SWA says, "Okay, we're clamping down on this. We have to get a little bit tighter on what all of these designations mean." So this was back. 25-year-old vatted malt. We don't know. We have no idea what's in here, but obviously you can tell from the color that this is sherry, heavily sherry. You put your nose in that glass, it's heavily sherry, right? 25 years old. We know what happens with smoky whiskeys at 25 years old, right? That smoke turns into something completely different. Completely different. It doesn't even present itself anymore as smoke or as peat, but as this other sort of ethereal, type of organoleptic that's in there now. Boy, and again, I'm getting old wood. That's one of probably the primary thing I'm picking up here. And this is at 46, right? So that means I am going to put a drop of water in here, a couple drops. Yeah, and for me, that couple drops of water allows some of the orchard fruit to come out.
Yeah, I think it's better with water. I'd say I found it kind of odd on the palate, straight, but with water, it's balancing out a little bit. I can't really name what I was getting before the water.
Boy, ripe blackberries. Wow, that's pretty awesome. again, this was a Compass Box Hallmark with vatted malts, blended malts. These are some of the most unappreciated whiskeys ever on any marketplace. A good vatted malt, it could be 2, it could be 3. Typically with a vatted malt, because they're not using grain whiskey, they're going to actually keep the component whiskeys down to a small handful. You're never going to get more than a handful of whiskeys in a vatted malt. And, these were the originals. This is actually how Usher started. This is how Dewar started. They started vatting malts together. There wasn't anything yet, that was grain whiskey yet. The coffee still hadn't been patented yet. And, Stein still was a failure when it first was put to use.
Yeah, finding history on old bottles really sucks sometimes, especially with independent bottlers that didn't last that long. Couldn't find anything. Can't even find a photo of the old shop with the sign. Can't even find it.
It's so funny. It's crazy, but it's like they never existed. Kind of like they were in communist Russia.
Now the store has been, I think, a Beretta gun club shop for a really long time.
There you go.
So I use the Wayback Machine, if anyone ever uses that, to look at old websites, and they take snapshots over time. So I did find an old price list. I shared it with Bill. This was 75 pounds, and the dates are all screwed up. The newsletters that they put out, I think that they were releasing some bottles before the shop opened. So there was all kinds of complications in terms of when Michael Jackson opened the shop. But around the late 90s, I believe, this bottle, maybe it was early 2000s, but this bottle was released at 75 pounds on that original price sheet. So 75 pounds at that time means there's probably really good malts that they had to account for when they put this out. And I believe they only sold this one in the U.S. according to that price sheet. So that tells you a lot. I mean, a Talisker, a Talisker that was bottled in '89 that was 14. I forget what everything was on there was 26 pounds. I mean, everything there was what you would expect to be late 90s, early 2000s prices. But this one was really intriguing. It was very odd that this one was 75 pounds for a vatted malt, which probably nobody knew what that was at the time.
So, do we know when this was bottled?
According to that, it would have been late 90s. I can actually
late 90s. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Now think about that. Late 90s. No one in the U.S. is drinking Scotch whiskey. Think about that. This is right before the next surge. Right. This is right before, and those who are drinking Scotch whiskey are getting turned on to Macallans and Glenlivets and things like that as single malts. But that's very, very small. We were not drinking Scotch whiskey in the late 90s, so that's very interesting. At 75 pounds, which would, I don't know, what would that translate to in late 90s dollars? Maybe 150, 125. That's a lot of money, for a vat of malt. The finish on this, I think, is extraordinary.
Yeah, sorry. The website went live in 2001. I'm sorry. They did bottle some before that. So it would have been 99, 2000, and depends on when they actually started selling it. And I think when the shop opened, they just had some extra stock of random stuff that they were still selling.
Yeah.
There is no date on the bottle. There was no code. There was no code behind the label. So I wouldn't know the exact bottling date other than that. And Bill, you might know compared to some other bottles you have, but I couldn't find it.
This is about as bespoke as it gets. And I will tell you that it was one of the shopkeepers that went down in the cellar and started blending shit together that created this. This is typically how these things came about.
Well, I'll tell you that I'm looking at the malts I have from them. They're all bottled in April of 2000. So the Aberfeldy, Craigellachie, Glendullan, Glen Grant, Longmorn, and Manickmore, they all say bottled April 2000.
Okay. Yeah.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So I mean, the shop didn't really last that long, did it? It's too bad. And as James actually put the notes on this together. There was a lot of connection between Milroy's, the current Milroy's of Soho, and and the vintage Hallmark of St. James. And it was, I think it was a Dunk Wallace Milroy was one of the people who was responsible for the popularity of the shop at that particular time as well. So I think that says a lot for the way shopkeepers regarded each other, except obviously for Berry Brothers of Rudd, who scrubbed their name off of the internet after they closed them down. I'm making that up. They didn't do it.
Hey, Robin, on the back of this, there's actually a tasting note from Wallace Milroy.
Is there?
Yeah.
Is that this one on the screen? A classic, well-balanced marriage of malts?
No, this is like the Glendulin that I grabbed, and it just has a light golden coppery hue, rich, creamy, and fruity bouquet with floral overtones and lots of promise, fruity, nutty taste with lingering honeyed mellowness and a long, satisfying finish. Wallace Milroy Spirits Connoisseur.
And when? What year was that?
April 2000, distilled April 78.
So April 78 was before they started using Glendulin for the Singleton. They were still using a Truist for the Singleton. They hadn't been. Glendulin was just like a malt distillery at that time. That's interesting.
Well, it lists their website as Hallmark of St. James.com on the label, and this was actually bottled. It's a 750. It was bottled at 63.9.
Yeah, someone in China owns that URL right now. So just so you know.
It doesn't go anywhere actually.
I tried it a couple times.
Oh, I know what I can do. There we go. I'll put this in the chat in case anybody's ever interested. Excellent dram. There's a lot of history. There's another pretty grim story about how it ended, but I don't know the whole story, so I don't want to put any wrong information out there. But read about it. There's a story about Michael Caine coming in to talk to them about wine. He left with 9,000 pounds of wine after tasting it with them. There's all sorts of great stories about the group that started it, the Milroy's connection. Wallace Milroy was a consultant that helped them get started and open up the shop. And I think what they did was borrow or sell a lot of those old casks so that the vintage Hallmark of St. James could get started and actually have some of their own brand in addition to all the other things that they sold. But a lot of history, there's a lot more to it, but I think Robin, you characterized everything really well. What a great dram, and I think it's a romantic dram, just about the story and the history, and not knowing what's in here is actually quite a positive thing, because our minds can only wander because it's so good.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, all of these guys obviously were negociants. They all started out the wine trade, every one of them, because that's really where the money was at, right? And, and here's one of the reasons, too, is because, they were all, they were wine negociants in England. Everybody knows about Stephen Spurrier, from the 1970s. But this goes all the way back into the 19th century. And then the phylloxera craze, the phylloxera plague hit. And it wipes out the rootstock in France, which means it wipes out brandy and sherry. And in replacement of that was initially, believe it or not, was Irish whiskey. The Irish, the Dubliners were the first one to actually get into France and solve the spirit needs of the French aristocracy with essentially pot still Irish whiskey. And then they got upstaged, by the Scots, because the Scots started using the coffee still, and they started making grain whiskey, and they started making much more delicate, much more drinkable, and even more importantly, with grain whiskey, it allows me as a blender to actually make a particular type of a whiskey for a particular type of a population. So I know that the people in Glasgow like it big and smoky. I know that the people in Edinburgh like it a little bit more spicy and refined. I know that the people in France like it so different than the way than the people in Nice. And that's what started the big Scotch whiskey blend explosion. And the first ones in was Tommy Dewar, He was 23 years old. If Tommy Dewar was alive today, he would be the top Instagram influencer out there. And, created, whiskey about Scotland, Scotch whiskey, the whole idea of commercialized Scotch whiskey. And then was followed by Johnny Walker. To this day, France is the largest importer of blended Scotch whiskey in the world. This is always something that shocks a lot of people. But so these independent bottlers and these blenders, they were wine merchants as well. Who was the most recent wine merchant that got into Scotch whiskey? Anybody know?
Wait, did
Mark
you say the late?
Is that Mark Renier with Bruichladdich?
Mark Renier. I was told a story the other night about Mark Renier. His father was a wine merchant, and that when he was growing up, when he was like 6 years old, his sister and he were not allowed to be sat at the table until they could actually taste the wine and talk all about the nuances of the wine and what grapes and everything like that. At 6 years old, that would be a form of sort of like child abuse today. But he grew up in the wine business and was a negociant and had this idea about reopening Bruichladdich. And that's essentially why we have the word terroir involved in Scotch whiskey. It's only because of Mark Renier. It's not that there really is terroir. It's just that Mark Renier brought that language over, and Jim McEwen thought it was an awesome idea. So that's Bruichladdich, but very different. So now we're going to come into this now a straight ahead 30-year-old blended Scotch whiskey at 46%.
Hey, Robin, before we do that, just want to let people know if they're interested. Hallmark also did some rums, cool. and they did Armagnac.
Nice.
So they were pretty diverse.
Yeah. Well, again, that would make perfect sense. They were a wine shop. They were a wine shop that became a whiskey shop.
And I will interject that I think actually even more recent than Bruichladdich, Tullabarden was bought by wine merchants.
Yeah, that's another great example. Exactly. Yep. Tully was by I don't. Do you know who they are by any chance, Josh?
Well, the Wikipedia said I remember they were wine people, but I couldn't remember, and it says Picard Van et Spiritueuse, but there's not even a link for that. So
yeah, okay. Cool. So this is Spirit of Freedom. This was the bottle. The great story on this is awesome. It was bottled to celebrate the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce led Scotland to victory. This was after Wallace was taken out, and this was really one of the great Scottish independent victories right here under Robert the Bruce. So this is a commemorative bottling. I think that's a picture of him on the label right there in full battle regalia, I believe. 30 years old, 46 ABV, bottled in 2014. This is a combination of bourbon and sherry casks. And wow, this is just, the malt on this is just amazing. And look at this, 75% malt whiskey, right? And only 25% grain. That's some people who really understood how to blend right there. Just using that grain for just that little bit of white and only using 5 distilleries. So this sounds as if they were kind of like echoing what, UDV was doing with the single malt of Scotland, where they were getting one from each of the regions right there. So this is actually this is really lush, man. I mean, it's just a really, really rich malt on this, and the attendant fruits that come along with it, but malt for me is really the dominant on this. When you look at the color, I would be very, And one of the nice things that most independent bottlers that turned blenders did is that they tend not to over process the whiskeys. They tend not to put the caramel coloring in these. They tend not to chill filter these whiskeys. And that's what's the beauty about what these small guys were doing. Because quite honestly, a chill filtering operation, that's an expense that then you have to pay for. You go to the bottling hall, you're going to have to pay to actually chill filter. Depending on how many screens you put in there, you're going to have to pay for each one of those. So yeah, I mean, and again, I think they were coming from that wine background where it's as close to the way the whiskey was is how we want to present it. You know, and you can tell there's not a whole lot of caramel coloring in this. It's a little sherry barrel.
Oh, it's excellent. And with all the all the Springbank craze today, it's good to see the history of what they've done over the years. I mean, this was 8 years ago, and 75 pounds at release, and it was. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, when I taste this, I do get Springbank out of it, and I'm always thinking, is that a mind game, or were they really trying to showcase, hey, like we want our spirit to shine, and then we'll add in some others.
It would not have surprised me. It would not have surprised me at all that they used. Hey, it is Mitchell, right? I mean, they've been around since 1820 for a reason. Yeah, and when you think about, wouldn't Springbank make a fucking awesome anchor of a blend?
Yeah,
it's mind blowing.
It definitely has that mouthfeel, that viscous, oily mouthfeel that I would expect from a Campbellton in general and a Springbank in particular. So,
what's interesting though is what were they using out of Springbank? Because I'm not picking up a whole lot of smoke here. So were they sort of like were they using sort of like the Hazelburn?
Hazelburn, the unpeated one, yeah.
Yeah, of Springbank. It comes right out of there, but it's a little bit different, right? And again, the Hazelburn's even a little lighter on the mouthfeel too. That's very cool. This is why people drank Scotch.
That's one of the fun things about blends is trying to dissect them and figure out, like, what the heck went into this and what's dominant in here and what stands out, especially if you have a good repertoire of single malt scotches, you can try to do that.
I can tell you this, Jim, that a good blender doesn't want you to know.
Sure.
And they don't want you to know, not for a lack of transparency, but they don't want you to know because, and again, you get this from the Japanese. It's the blending is paramount here. Blending is the art form.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if your blend is too reflective of a particular source whiskey, then you might as well just buy the source whiskey. If Dewar's starts tasting too much like Aberfeldy, then why am I not just buying Aberfeldy?
There you go. Right. Sure.
And this is also 30-year. It's not like, hey, here's a couple casks that we have randomly. To do a 30-year blend, they've got to get 30+ year from all over. That means it's probably not 30, it's probably a little bit older. Meaning that the Springbank, Hazelburn, whatever's in it, was also 30-year. This was a year that they started, or not started, but they were still putting in a lot of these private casks. They're putting all these private casks that people bought in the 90s. They're just trying to bottle them and get them out. And I'm sure they had something back there. But for a 30-year cask at the time in 2014 was probably pretty rare. There aren't any more, like on whiskey base, there aren't any 30-year Springbanks or Hazelburns out there. Like it was, it was probably Springbank or some version of Hazelburn.
I did taste one. So I was at whiskey school this year at Springbank, and we had a Dunwich tasting, and they did pull one out. from all the private casks. So yeah, they did exist, but you're right. When you think about how much of this did they put out, we don't know. Was this a limited edition blend? It was, commemorating the 700th anniversary of Bannockburn. Could have been, they could have used one cask. Who knows?
You can still find this if anyone's interested. Auction, other places. I see it come up every once in a while. It doesn't say Springbank on the label, so that's a benefit. You can get it at a discount. But if you really like it, keep an eye out. You could probably find it somewhere.
What was the price on the auction price that you saw? Remember?
I think I bought it off someone off of Facebook or something, like $300. Oh. I'll find out. I don't know. Okay. It was something. It wasn't extravagant by any means. It was a good deal.
Cool.
So anyway, Robin, Harold had a quick question about maybe if you know or anyone about if there's a 30-year-old Hazelburn at the time. I don't know when Hazelburn.
I saw this was bottled in 2014, and my understanding was that they only started triple distilling in the late 90s. So I guess the math doesn't add up for me. But maybe they had old casks of something that they called Hazelburn. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, as a commercial entity, yeah, Hazelburn didn't exist. Absolutely. Yeah. But given the fact that they still had all three stills there, right? Who knows what they were doing, especially during the whiskey lock when actually it was interesting. One of Wright was very much like he was very much like John Grant at Glenfarclas. When all the orders stopped coming in, he doubled down and produced more. So like a very, very odd thing, because I think both of them knew, and this is one of the things I learned from Springbank when I was there. Over a 175-year time, you start seeing things in a long arc of time, and you realize, okay, we're in this thing right now. It's going to end at one point. So yeah, but that again, commercially, yeah, you're right. It wasn't available at all, but So yeah, so while you've got the other one, next one sitting in the glass, this was like the big thing. This is a coffee still on the left-hand side. That's actually the actual coffee configuration. Robert Stein had made a single version column back in the early 1800s, and he adapted that from a French design that was used to separate beets from beet sugar. And he put grain through that, a grain match through that, and it was kind of like an abysmal failure. And that's where coffee got the idea to take Stein's idea as single still, break it into two parts, into the analyzer and into the rectifier, and then patent this in 1831. And then all of these merchants, like the Dewars and the Buchanans, invested in the coffee still, because obviously he couldn't sell it in Ireland. They hated him. The Jamesons hated him. The Powers hated him. They considered coffee still whiskey to be close to the plague. So this was really like the big break open for Scotch whiskey. This is why we even get here to this point, was because they were able to create all these different styles now. Now they can micro blend for a population and give people exactly what it is that they want. And you end up like two different types of drinking styles, that come as a result of this. Blended Scotch is definitely much more sociable, stylistically different. It was meant to mix. Typically, it was less expensive. You didn't have to be a quote unquote connoisseur in order to appreciate it. And it comes in a whole bunch of varieties and styles, and very, very different from malt drinking, then and especially now. So that kind of brings us to this next guy right here. There's a crazy history with Ainsley's here. But man, the nose on this is it's the most unique one so far, because this is where you start getting the burnt rubber, you know, in Scotch whiskey.
I was nosing across, and my nose was still sort of not quite there yet, and first three were like, and then that's like, whoa, okay, something's going on. I mean, definitely some bottle effect on it, but yeah.
Now, have anybody put any water in it yet? And James, what is this? What is the proof coming in on this? This is, do we know?
Okay, first I'll go by the bottle. According to the bottle, I don't know, and there is no. But did we put it?
But you estimated this is 1950s, 1960s juice, right?
60s when I looked at it, because then the spring cap went away after that. Towards the end of the 60s and the 70s, it went towards slightly different cap, and the cap is really key when you start to age them going back through the decades.
Yeah. So Josh, that thing goes, it jumps in the back seat with a little 1 or 2 drops of water.
Yeah, and a lot of like grape juice or grape wine on the nose.
Yeah, so these are the guys that acquired Brora Distillery, James Ainsley. They sold it. They took over Kleinleaf eventually. Then they sold it. So I mean, a big guess is, that is some of that in this blend. Either Brora or Kleinleaf. And neither of them are on the nose. That's for sure.
Yeah, famously, there was a series of these that did not have a proof on it, and it was always up for discussion. I don't know why. I don't know how that's legal or whatnot. I have no idea. But I assume this is 40%, somewhere in there. And it's not a liqueur that it says, but it could be. It would usually say liqueur.
Liqueur was used a lot back then when in the days of blended whiskeys. You'll see that on a lot of old labels. It didn't mean what we know now today. You have to remember that the whole idea of regulations is something that evolved over time. And liqueur was just, it sounded French. It sounded fancy.
Since it's a spring cap, I assume the fill was sort of perfect, but how was the fill?
That's correct. So when I first opened it, I nosed it, and if you have these, you're like, okay, well, maybe this wasn't stored properly to some degree. It was intact, great shape. The liquid was at the neck. It was very good. But the nose is that kind of like, that spring cap, metallic caramel, all that. I am starting to get through that on the palate. The nose, it hasn't gone away, but on the palate, I'm actually getting something really nice out of it.
Well, so am I. And actually, with 2 drops of water in this as well, that effect, that nose effect, actually got dampened into something that's actually quite pleasurable.
I'm getting a little sort of back end of really, really light Highland peat.
Yeah.
Just a bit.
This, honest to God, this is, our olfactory is attached to the part of our brain that is our most primal. And this literally takes me back to some of the whiskeys that I remember smelling as a child. Some of those old blends, like the old Cuddies, and the old Pars and Buchanans that would be around, the adult house when I would be there sniffing bottles.
Serena's comment was that it just really noses just directly like a bottle of some sort of fortified wine, and I don't disagree with
Wow. That's it. Oh, that's interesting.
It really, to me, does nose like a wine much more than like a whiskey.
Huh.
I mean, actually, something more on the Madeira Marsala side than the sherry side.
It would be very interesting to, again, these guys were dealing in wine at the same time. Everybody was using different types of barreling. Would not surprise me at all.
I've had mine in the glass for over an hour. I did have it covered. I probably should not have covered it, actually, now that I think about it. But the nose reminds me of a lot of just old blends that you just kind of get. It just has that. The palate, I'm not getting too much on the front, but that might be because of some of the other whiskeys. But the finish is actually really unique. The finish for me is actually, there is a little bit of smoke, but I'm actually starting to pull out some more fruit and other flavors like on the finish. The finish is actually really nice. I did add a couple drops of water as well.
This one needed water. Yeah.
Do you remember where or how you got this, James?
Yes, this was another auction. And I remember before buying it, I had to ask them about the fill level. It's a dark bottle. I wanted to ask them about the capsule, the fill level. They said, no, it's in really good shape. And I'm more favorable towards the darker colored glass versus like really lucky on this one with a lighter color. This could have sat in a windowsill for 30 years. So I think it is what it is. It didn't look like it was stored improperly where you might get some weird, colors and dust landing on it. It looks like it was in a box for a really long time in someone's cellar because it was very clean. There is some wear to it, but the capsule was in excellent condition. Everything coming out was excellent condition as well.
See, for me, now this would not have been my favorite of the lineup so far. It's got a kind of a dusty, old wood finish for me on that. For me, it's not that's not one of my favorite things. Mid palate on this is really where it kind of shines. Because the fruitiness comes out on the mid palate, but yeah. So this is an interesting. This is again. I think I'm tasting history with this. This one actually tastes historical.
I just got a little bit of wax on the finish too, just a little bit.
Yep.
So we're about halfway. Anybody have any other burning questions they've been wanting to ask? Mark, Barbara, Adam, Anthony. We're a small group. If you have a question, just shout it out.
I'm going to load up this next guy here.
Yeah, so next we'll pour the Cadenheads Club. And I agree with what you said, Robin. I always say this, there's a certain romanticism with certain whiskeys and spirits. You actually came to that event, I think. It was the rum and Cuban cigar tasting.
Yeah.
And we had the Black Tot, the last consignment. Yeah. And there's a romanticism where you sit probably by yourself and you just really think about who was drinking this at one point, this exact liquid, who was drinking this at one point in time. Kings and queens and leaders and like just everyone around the world. And we're drinking it 50 years later, 60 years later, 70 years later. And it may taste slightly different, but if you think about it, most of it's still there. Like most of that flavor profile is there.
Well,
and it's really special.
And well, you're right. I'll tell you what's interesting is how our palates have actually changed, in the last 50 years. And here's one of the things that's very interesting. You realize that our parents and our grandparents were much more used to the taste of sulfur than we are. Sulfur was actually a flavor component that was not unusual for most of the 20th century. So when you get these big, rich and, kind of dirty and dusty and musky things, just to your point, we are drinking exactly with them, only our palates have changed. Our palates have changed completely. And, we don't put up with that shit anymore, like they did. For them, that was a whole different kind of complexity, you know. And it could have been that this was blended specifically for that reason. This was what they were shooting for, you know. This is what they were shooting for. Yeah, and so this kind of gives you an idea right here about how we change. And I actually, if you're interested, you can find this up on the whiskeywatch.com. But I wrote an article about how American palates have changed to where we are right now. And the reason is that we don't have a vocabulary for flavor in the U.S. because having a vocabulary for flavor was essentially considered un-American, because food was meant as a utilitarian aspect. It was fuel for most of the American experiment. And especially in the 20th century, when you think about, we went through World War I, that is privation. Then we went through Prohibition, where the only whiskeys coming through were actually lighter whiskeys coming in from Canada, right? And then we followed that by the Depression, more privation, and then World War II, more privation. By the time those generations came out of that, we didn't really have this whole idea that food should be this big, glorious thing. It was really meant to be utilitarian. How many kids grew up in America with the idea that when they were sat at the table, you were told to shut up and eat and then go out and play or go out and get something done? Because it really wasn't, look, Jim laughing because he knows, I know exactly, right? Because food was meant just as fuel, it was utilitarian, and we don't talk about it. So if something was like odd, like sulfur, that was part of it. Just eat it and shut up, you know. And but now, you know, we're different. We've got the internet, you know, and everyone knows what burrata is, you know. So it's a completely different thing. So, but in the 20th century, we had a whole bunch of different things, and the downfall of blended Scotch whiskey was when they started over processing it in order to meet these girls right here. Because these girls right here are indicative of what happened to drinking styles, right? It was all about vodka. It was all about gin. It was all about what we thought was tequila, but was actually, you know, Cuervo Gold. And it was all about, like, you know, California wine was on its ascendancy. So we're going for all of these lighter drinking, light beers, for God's sake. You know, there was the time of Amstel Lights, right? So everyone flattened out, and Scotch whiskeys tried to actually approximate that, but they couldn't. You know, an American whiskey is when they created a whole brand new category of light whiskeys, you know, to actually make it more like vodka. So that was the death of blended Scotch whiskeys, you know, in the late 20th century as a result of that. So drinking some of this old stuff like that is really kind of drinking with your grandparents' palates, which is actually kind of cool, you know, in a way. So that's going to bring us to this Cadenhead 40. And again, a blended Scotch. And Cadenheads, as we know, aligned also, you know, with J&A Mitchell and Son, who own Springbank. And a really interesting story about Cadenheads themselves, starting again as vintners, distillery agents. It was founded by a guy named George Duncan, and then his brother-in-law took it over when he passed away, and his name was Cadenhead. And then a guy named Robert Ducey, and Bill held up a bottle of Demerara rum there prior to this, and this guy named this Robert Ducey, who had it for a while, was known for actually just bottling malts and for Demerara rum. And then it passed over to a woman named Ann Oliver, who kept it going into the 1960s, through the 60s and into the 70s, but she wouldn't change anything, and she wasn't adapting to what the current tastes were. So they had this massive sale of the entire inventory, and it was the largest spirits and wines inventory sale in the whole history of the United Kingdom, 1972. And then right about that time, it was purchased by the Mitchell family from Springbank Bank. So it's been aligned with them ever since. So this is going back 40 years. Bottled in what? Do we know when this was bottled?
2020.
2020.
COVID.
2020. So it was bottled recently. So 40 years ago, it was inside of the Mitchell family. Right? Did I do my math right on that?
It's a sherry butt, 468 bottles.
That's correct. 1980. That's correct.
1980. Okay, yeah. So the Mitchells had this by then.
What would you
But
call
bottled
this?
2 years ago.
No, go ahead,
What's that?
Josh.
Bottled 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2020. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Robin, why would somebody, right or wrong, call this a modern blend? Are they looking to satisfy a different palate? When they released this, it flew off. Everyone really wanted to buy it. This was during COVID, maybe right at this. I don't know. It was like right when COVID was taken on. They couldn't get rid. It was complicated, but it tastes different than a lot of other blends that we try. And even for 40 years, it's bottled at a higher percentage. It's bottled at 44.7. And so they obviously want to do something really great for their club members, but at the same time, it tastes different than a lot of other blends that we see out there.
And when you so I'm going to have you answer your own question. What about this taste is modern?
I think that this is my opinion. I think that the integration of the different whiskeys that are in here kind of spike differently. They're not, so when I say, when I think about it like a blended whiskey, smooth, silky, a little bit lower ABV, there's a certain flavor profile, a lot of fruit, a little bit more like darker dried type fruit. But this is unlike any of that. This is basically how I would describe spiky. There's a lot of different things at play here. It's one of those that's really hard to nail down. And so whenever you try something like this, you're like, oh, this is a blend because it doesn't fit the profile of a single malt in a lot of ways. But the alcohol is a little bit prickly for like a Charlie McLean, where it's a little bit prickly. It kind of comes at you. And when I drink this as a 40-year, I'm not thinking, wow, this is a really old vanilla woody type whiskey. I'm thinking like, oh, this is a very unique spirit in here that someone had a lot of interesting ideas to get to this point. Is it the best 40-year-old whiskey? No, there's some single malts of 40 that are amazing, but this is very unique and it kind of jumps out. It kind of jumps at me, like I said, spiky. It kind of jumps and puts me in a few different directions.
So I'm actually I think the word modern. Somebody called this a modern. I don't know, a modern blend. Take a look at that bottle. It says matured in an oak cask. Oh, really? 40 years? What, you put it in a demijohn? So this is an overtly fruity whiskey. This is overtly fruity to me.
Is there a back label on this with more information, or is the lower part?
You can see the back label on Whiskey Base.
On this is clearly wrong.
Yeah,
back labels on Whiskey Base.
It basically talks about when it was distilled, bottled, age, strength. Cask was 1x sherry butt. There is some history on this in terms of they were put into a sherry butt and married together for a while. 468 bottles, and then some typical tasting notes about fruitcake, tangerine peel, all of that. But that's it. It doesn't tell you it. Again, when we talked earlier about transparency is not here. It's not here. Now, Cat and Heads is very open, though. If you ask them, they'll just tell you. I don't think it's a big secret, but they don't want to put it on the label, and that's a historical characteristic.
They're not allowed to. That was the whole idea that Compass Box got in trouble with. They can't do that. But again, the whole idea of the blenders, they don't want to. But I'm getting tangerine fruit. I got peach in here. I got some lemon. It's you know how what a blender looks like? They look at top note, bottom note, and they find the middle note from there. This is very top noting. Very top noting. And what's surprising is that it's a 40-year-old whiskey. It's a 40-year-old whiskey. So there's none of what we picked up in Ainsley's in here. You know, that's what I find really unusual about it. I like it. I think it's a very, very delicious whiskey. Yeah, vibrant would be a wonderful word for it. It's very good, but I'm just surprised. I'm just surprised that it's like 40 years old, because there's nothing, there's no bottom note. Typically, you look, you're going to get a bottom note in a 40-year-old whiskey, and it's just not here. So this was blended for the modern palate, all right. You know?
Well, it's just also a little weird that if you're to believe what it says on the bottle, all of the component whiskeys were distilled in 1980, right? It is like literally 40 years old, according to the bottle.
That's almost a vintage, you know, when you think about it. It was a 1980 vintage, you know, yeah. You know?
Right. So it's just, I mean, who makes a blend like that, where everything is literally, because at some point they married them together. It sounds like they married them together not at the moment of bottling. So at some point they took all of these 1980s casks, although not much, because it only yielded one cask in the end, or one that they bottled for this. I suppose they maybe there's going to be a 50-year version of it.
I can tell you what they did do here. They used some really well-charged grain whiskey. What I mean by well-charged is that those were in very active barrels, probably first fill, and that's one of the things that you can tell from this. And that's why it keeps its top notiness from first fill grain whiskeys that were really well matured as well, you know, in first fill ex-bourbon barrels. That would probably be the key to what is keeping this, you know, so, and it's got a nice lushness to it too. So, you know.
I just wanted to throw out there was a comment on Whiskey Base that the speculation is that this is one of those famous Edrington blends that Ken has put out in the past few years. But I just want to get your opinion on this, Robin, because obviously we had a small discussion at Matt's one time about how the 80s had so much turnover, and we were talking about that Highland Park bottle in particular of the owners behind Highland Park at the time. Who was it? It must have been before Edrington. So a lot of people, when they hear Edrington blends and these newer blends that have been put out these days, I think a lot of people tend to lean towards, it has to be Macallan, Highland Park, Tamdu, whatever it was. But in this one specifically, it's interesting. I get a lot of modern, like Glenrothes on it. When we get like those candied orange notes and tangerine notes, I sort of get that feel to it. I haven't done the research. I don't know when Edrington owned Glenrothes, but I'd be interested. And that would make sense also why the vintage is all 1980, but they all got it from the same stock.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar with what an Edrington blend would be. Yeah, I don't know what that means. But you look at the color of this. So the color of this is for 40 years old. This is not telling me there's a whole lot of sherry barrel in here. There's not a whole lot of sherry barrel.
I was just going to say, somebody mentioned that the blend was aged in a single sherry butt, but one thing I always keep in mind when I'm looking at older Scotch whiskeys is 1973 is when Spain stopped exporting sherry in barrels. And so, obviously the Scotch being as thrifty as they are, second fill casks were used, but the late 70s, early 80s is when you started to have that shift to stuff that was going into new barrels was going into bourbon casks. So some of these component whiskeys may very well be bourbon cask aged. And that's gonna change the influence of the sherry notes, certainly.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're 100%. I agree with you, and that's going to lend itself to the color as well.
The color and the flavor profile of the nose, all of that. If these are really that 40-year almost vintage, like you said, you know, some of these component whiskeys are definitely going to be bourbon barrel as opposed to sherry butt, and that's going to have an influence.
You know, Harold, it was interesting you mentioned about Glenrothes, because right when you said that, I got this little kind of like a straw hay-like note on the back of the palate, which always reminds me of Glenrothes. So I mean, who knows? I mean, it's funny what our flavor components will do. You know,
I think this would be. I mean, I would challenge anybody if you gave them this blind, regardless of whether you told them it was a blend or not, to peg this at 40 years old.
Yeah, I would be shocked to actually know that this was 40 years old. Yeah, like I said, so much high note on this, not a lot of low notes, not a lot of bottom notes. Yeah, it's quite good. It's very good. So maybe I do have a modern palate.
I mean, I'd be more likely to peg the Hallmark 25 as being 40 years old than this.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great as we start to venture into even our last dram. You know, first impressions are everything. We did a tasting here a couple days ago with SMWS. And SMWS is doing a lot with blends, and first impressions are everything. They want that first note that jumps out at you on the label, colorized lemon, marmalade, whatever BS, and that's kind of like what modern blends are in a way. It's like we want somebody to buy it. So let's come up with a unique way for them to kind of like associate a flavor profile in their mind and say, I like lemons, I'm gonna buy it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, who doesn't like lemons? You know?
That's right, exactly. And I mean, this one kind of portrays that. It doesn't taste 40 years old, but in that tasting we had, there's a story that came out about Highland Park. They bought a whole allotment of Highland Park. They married it all together and then refilled it into barrels. And then each of those barrels they bottle. And we were talking about, is that a single barrel? Is that a single cask? We have no idea. We have no idea what that is. And that's where some of these modern blends are starting to go, which is, again, if it tastes really good in the glass, does it matter? Does it really matter if they tell you exactly what's in here? Because this is absolutely delicious. It doesn't taste 40 years in comparison, but it tastes pretty amazing. And this is still available if anyone wants to find it. You can still get it at auction and things. But I think everyone does things a certain way. Cannon Heads does things their way, which this is very fitting. But again, it's like first impressions. I want a 40-year blended. This doesn't disappoint.
Yeah, no, awesome.
Well, and the society is changing things, because I know that they got a huge lot of 1964 Glenfarclas. And for the longest time, they were bottling that as 25-year-old, 26-year-old, 29-year-old, 30-year-old, 35-year-old, 40-year-old. And, you know, each one was slightly different, and the prices went up slightly, but they weren't crazy. But it was cool because they were all basically sister casks laid down at the same time, that they got this big parcel. And now they're doing the opposite, where they're just, you know, trying to, I don't know, make it more homogenous.
Yeah. All right. So this slide I have up here right now is the truth behind blending and the truth behind Scotch whiskey. So everybody knows I'm an anti-terroirist, right? Because I don't believe in terroir in whiskey. And I also don't believe in the 5 regions of Scotch whiskey as a flavor style. And here's the reason why. And now you're viewing this, and I've been chased by the CIA. I know I'm under a kill order because I have this, and now you're actually part of this as well. This is the blender's map from UDV, United Distillers and Vintners. And this tells you the real truth of Scotch whiskey. So what they've done is that, you know, in order for the, you know, again, blends are the backbone of the entire industry. We need to actually, we're blending because we're looking for a level of consistency. How do we maintain that? We take all of the malts that are in our realm, and we then categorize them by groups. Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4. Group 5, Group 6, all the way there's 9 groups. And then we put them on a map that looks like the Washington, D.C. metro map. and we get an idea about how all of these whiskeys have a relationship to each other. So, for example, if you look over on the one line that goes straight from the top left all the way down through, it starts with Belle Blair on the left and ends with Glengarry on the right. Look at that line. Look at the stop number 2 is Balvenie. Okay. Now, look below that on the dark gray line that starts with Benrinnes on the left and ends to the right with Glenfiddich. As we all know, they're owned by the same company, and both of them are across the street from each other in Dufftown. Yet they both belong to 2 different grouping places. So this is essentially how Scotch whiskey should be looked at, and this is where the blenders were really, really critical in understanding on how to group and how to put together Scotch whiskey. Is this up on a link here, James? Do you have this on a link?
Yeah, I just added it if anybody wants to save it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, nice.
Oh, that's great. Well, I've got the whole book that it comes from. It talks about toasting levels and char levels and everything like that. It was the entire blender's booklet. And who gave that to me? But a guy named John Glazer when I started working for him. Okay. He goes, here, you might find this interesting. He says, but you can't keep it. You got to give it back to me. So I had to make copies of all the pages and give it back to him. So, yeah, so John, this is John in his lab. This is early times, like when I started working with him in early 2009. It was just John and Greg Glass and myself. And Greg Glass now has gone on to work with Richard Patterson and White Mackay as a blender for Jura as well. But when John told me about the General that was coming up, I was pretty damn excited about this because this really proves what blenders do. I don't really care about provenance. I don't really care about anything. What's going on inside this barrel is knocking my socks off, and I'm going to blend this into something really spectacular. And that's essentially the story behind the General, right? Only 1,678 bottles made. On the label, it says ridiculously rare. That kind of give you an idea about, what he thought about this. These were both blended Scotch whiskeys that were blended at a young age and then forgotten about. They were put in barrels matured in sherry butt. There was 2 different parcels. One parcel essentially got 2 phone calls from 2 people within maybe a 3-month period. One came from Gordon MacPhail, and they said, "Hey, we got a lot of a couple barrels of this blend we put together. We think it was the old Glen Calder blend that they used to do from Gordon MacPhail. It was 40 years old. It was matured in sherry barrels." And then a broker calls them up and said, "Hey, I've got a parcel of some 33-year-old blends that were matured in sherry butts. Are you interested?" And John tasted examples from all of both parcels, bought both parcels, blended them both together, and that is the General. And it's just, it lives up to its name. And the General was, as you can probably imagine, it was actually based. It was named after, who do you think?
That's a good question.
George Patton.
Buster Keaton.
Ah, yes.
It was named after not after Buster Keaton, but in commemoration of Buster Keaton, because it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous that he had gotten these whiskeys, and it was ridiculous that he was able to put them together, and that's what kind of made him think about Buster Keaton.
Now, Robin, did he talk about like the holy shit moment where it's like you blend it together, like, oh, this is it, like stop everything, like this is it?
Oh yeah, well that's exactly. Well, see, that's exactly what this is all about. So this is, at one point you put it together and then you say, done. We got it. Yeah. And essentially, blenders look for that. Every blend that I've ever talked to, and I've talked to people blending it, like, everybody from Rachel Berry to Shinji Fukuyo to, there you go. There's Buster Keaton the General. Perfect. Yeah. There you go. Awesome.
I'm sensing a watch party, Robin.
What's that? Oh, that'll be fun. We'll do a watch.
I've never seen it.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's one of the greatest movies ever done. You've seen outtakes of it because you've seen some of the stunts that were done in the General, especially the one with the train. So, but yeah, every blender does that. This is what makes, and one of the things I learned from John is that there's two variables in malt whiskeys. It's cooperage and age. That's it. But as a blender, your palate is wide open. It's really where creativity begins. It's really where, where the whole thing comes together. That's why I was so blown away by the early blends that I had of his, like a Sila, like Eleuthera, which is one of the great unicorn whiskeys on the marketplace, And again, it's what allowed, the blends is really what allowed Scotch to play a part of the early cocktail movement when it started again. So then you started coming, I remember on a cruise ship, and they were making Blood and Sands with Glenmorangie, Rob Roy's, Bobby Burns, Mamie Taylor's, which is essentially the, a Mamie Taylor is the Scotch version of a Moscow Mule. Obviously the highball, and then the modern classic, of course, is the penicillin. But it really kind of opened up, Scotch whiskey for a whole lot of people. And that's, people are blending much more now than they're starting to use the word blend in Kentucky now. Unbelievable. Kentucky stayed away from that word forever. And now, Marianne Eves and Jackie Zykan and the guys at Barrel Bourbon, they all call themselves blenders. So it's coming to a whole new age here.
I'm curious if anybody's trying this for the first time. What do you think? Maybe everybody here has had it before. It's
been years since I've had it, so this is a great reintroduction for me.
It's been probably about 4 years, I think, since I've had it. I had it at a tasting with Show and Kronk and some others here, Lautman here, and we did a blind round of expensive blends, variety. We had a couple of different King George Fives. We had the boutique 50-year, a variety of things, and this was, I believe, the unanimous first choice. Is that we had the Black Bull 40, the original Black Bull 40, and this was, I think, the unanimous first choice. The really funny thing that I'm getting right now, so one of my favorite whiskeys of the year is the Southern California Whiskey Club Select Cask of Glasgow Blend. So it's the Glasgow Blend, but aged in a Cameron Bridge cask. They're kind of
cask, right?
oddly similar. Yeah, it's a single cask of the blend. So they took the blend and then married it in a Cameron Bridge cask, and that was the one that single cask that Southern California Whiskey Club selected. They're kind of oddly similar. I'm doing them side by side now, and there's definitely it sort of feels like when you hear an orchestra tuning, right? I mean, as I go back and forth, they're not the same, but they're definitely in tune with one another. And that bottle is currently $41 at K&L versus $3,000 for the General.
Glasgow Blend may be one of the most brilliant whiskeys on the marketplace.
But
You know,
that,
they-
yeah, but that
Without-
the Southern
without a
California
doubt.
Whiskey Club cast.
Yeah.
Robin, have you tasted the Southern California Whiskey Club?
I've
edition?
not tasted that one yet. I'm sure it's spectacular, but you know, to your point, John has an idea about what a house style is like, and Glasgow Blend has been around much longer than the General. So it would not surprise me that he had Glasgow Blend in the back of his head when he hit that aha moment with the General.
Yeah.
It would not surprise me, because
Well,
Glasgow
I
was specifically meant to be, you know, when he first started out, he stayed away from sherried whiskeys. He said, I don't want to deal with sherried whiskeys because it takes away from the art of blending. So he worked primarily with 100% ex-bourbon barrels. Glasgow Blend was the first time he brought sherried whiskeys in, and he started discovering, you know, that whole, you know, bottom note part of the sherry whiskey. So yeah, I can see where there would be a.
And I will say, a totally, very, very different whiskey. Right?
Oh no, there's no one's implying. No one's implying that they're the same whiskey. No one's implying they're the same whiskey. You know.
Yeah. No. But I'm saying a totally different compass box that I really adore.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Never sold in the U.S. A lot of fun. Is much more like sort of old school 70s blends, really light and fruity and fun.
So, Robin, you worked at Compass Box. How does a company go from this? I mean, it's all downhill from here. Like it's a shitty thing to say. It's all downhill. It's
no, not at all. No, that's not the idea of Compass Box, and that's not the idea of blending either.
Right.
So that was it's perfectly in line. It's perfectly in line with what the thinking of Compass Box is. And now, if you look at Compass Box right now, it's really all about the limited edition. And John doesn't even blend anymore. John now has taken the role of sort of like chief blender. You've got James over here, and I can't remember her name. The other, the woman that he's working with. He's got two blenders. And James is pretty much like the lead on this, James Saxon, and they're Jill. It's James and Jill, and so they're but he's sort of like he's working as he gets the final sign off on this. He sets the creative direction on this. You know, now everybody knows what happened with Compass Box in the past couple of months, right? So now they are part of a larger organization, like someone's bought into Compass Box now, and so I'm not exactly sure where the direction of the company is going right now. But it's in the years since I left, and I've been gone now 7+ years. They've sort of like, you know, it used to be all about Flaming Heart, and now, you know, Flaming Heart, and there's all these other different like limited editions that come out now. You know? Yep. So yeah, it's very consistent with their thinking. Very, very consistent.
Yeah. Well, let's go around. Something typical we do is go around, and everyone, if you can highlight what stood out to you, what was your favorite, what surprised you. It's always interesting to hear because not everybody always feels the same way. There's probably some surprises that came out along the way. Olaf, would you go first? What was your favorite? What stood out to you? Or I'm sorry, what was your favorite? And then what surprised you?
Sure. So I do think I have to go back and try this again when I've been in the glass for a while, but because like just smelling them now, they smell a bit different, and I think these need a little bit more time. For me, I think the Spirit of Freedom was, I think, my favorite of the night. I mean, the general is really good. Actually, I haven't had it since Robin was pouring at Whisky Live the year it came out. So that was the only time I tried it, actually. So it's nice coming back to it this time. But yeah, I think the Spirit of Freedom so far was my favorite of the evening.
Oh, really nice. John Glazer's going to be in town in New York next week. I don't know if you're going, Robin, to Fine and Rare on Tuesday. If anybody goes, ask him, hey, where's the general? Okay. Barbara and Adam, thank you for joining. Anything you want to share? What was your favorite? Really curious to hear how you guys thought about the tasting.
I also like the Spirit of Freedom the best.
Yeah, I like the Ainsleys, but that was good too.
Very nice. Were any surprises? Anything that you thought, oh, this might be a certain way? Maybe you even knows it the first time, but then after a while, you're like, I actually really dig this. Any of those stand out?
The ones I really dug all of them myself. What about you?
Yeah.
Very nice. I think it was a good mix of, I don't know if there's any 40%, but different ABVs as well. I think, Robin, you did a good job of taking us through kind of a lower ABV to the higher. I think it worked really well. Josh and Serena, what about you guys?
I would say that I also don't know if I'd say Spirit of Freedom was necessarily my first choice. I did like it more than the Ainsleys. The Ainsleys was just kind of all over the place. I actually was really pleasantly surprised by the Isle of Skye 18 year, but I suspect that the current one is probably as good as the 1970s one. But I really quite liked that actually.
I was a big fan of the Spirit of Freedom. It was the only one that I could like identify a sort of tropical fruit, sort of large presence, which I'm a big sucker for. And I think I was surprised by in the vintage Hallmark of St. James, even though it was just at 46 ABV, and I normally wouldn't think to add water. Adding just a few drops of water really opened up the palate, and in a way that, I didn't see it coming at all before adding water.
Yeah, that was a very weird one without water, and then with water really changed quite a bit. And then I actually went back and poured. I mean, once we finished with water, I went back and poured a little more. And I was like, going the other direction, it was even like more pronounced how weird it was without water. But with water, it really changed significantly and became much more sort of normative in some sense. But it wasn't offensive without water, but it was just really quite odd. I think what I was getting in the end was a ton of tobacco, actually, which I think got subdued by the water, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. And Robin, we can still see your screen if you want to stop sharing.
Yeah, Robin, you're renting a car?
The Spirit of Freedom is interesting because everyone knows that Springbank is like blown up. The latest 30 that they released was released for like 800 pounds, but it's reselling at $2,000 to $2,500, and someone's buying it. I don't know who, but what a deal! So let the bidding wars begin. Next time the show's up at auction, we can all bid against each other for the Spirit of Freedom 30. Bill Myers. Bill, so you've had, you had a lot of Hallmark. You've tried, I think, some of these before. What did you think? What was your favorite? What stood out?
So I really like that Hallmark, but that's right down my alley in terms of style. I really like the Ainsley. I mean, that was just super interesting, and I love that sulfur. In fact, I've got a really weird Lombard Bunnahabhain 25 that has that same kind of burnt rubber note. In fact, I think Jim Murray gave it like a 67 or something. But it's so pronounced that for me, it's kind of like what Lefroy is for like Glenlivet drinkers. That's what this Bunnahabhain's like for me for like, at regular Isla drinkers. It's just weird, but I like it. So those were my main two. I like, everything was good. I'm actually right now trying this old pure malt, and it's really crazy. It's got more smoke.
Is that the Johnny Walker? Yeah.
Right. This is old. I think this was it might have been like a duty free. It's got no barcode.
That's exactly what it was. That's how they created that brand with the duty free.
It's 1 liter, 1 liter, 43%. I mean, I like the regular one. I haven't bought any in a while when they changed the label, but this is like really fun. And then I'm curious, and actually, Robin, you might know the answer to this. What is the deal with John Barr? Because it seems like it's like knockoff Johnny Walker, and there's a blue label, a black label, a gold label, and then here's a John Barr pure malt that's also got a green label that's surprisingly the same color.
John Barr is made by Hold on.
It says imported by Capstone International in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Yeah.
Is that the same guy that brought in the pure malts?
No. John Barr is a historical figure. I want to say it's international Interbev. I think it was them that made. I can't remember who creates the blend. But it's a blending house.
I've only seen the black label recently. I mean, I haven't seen the gold, blue, or green in like forever.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
McKay.
Who?
The
White Mackay?
Yeah, Mackay brother, or White and Mackay brother, or White.
Mackay. That's yeah.
That was
So yeah, that's Richard Patterson, you know, and yeah. I knew it was like one of those old blending houses. So yeah, it's just one of their blends. You know, it's funny. The U.S. is not the big. So the thing about blends is that different markets have different blends go to them. So for example, Johnny Walker Red is all over Central America. I mean, it lives in Central America. Dewar's is the United States is the biggest Dewar's drink, for example. So they market these in different parts of the world. And John Barr was a latecomer to a U.S. It was actually meant to. It was a blend for somewhere else.
Well, the odd thing about the marketing of Red is that in the U.S., sometime in the last few years, they have targeted Red really specifically at the African American community. The marketing is really heavily targeted at the African American community for that. I don't know what made them decide that. I should say, I think when I was talking about the Spirit of Freedom, I think I compared it to the Ainsleys, and I meant to actually compare it to the Cadenheads. You know, in the end, I thought the Cadenheads was like fine, but I literally have no notes about it, and I have lots of notes about the others.
Same.
It was like fine, but there was nothing here that wasn't fine. Well, you know, the Ainsleys was odd, but the Cadenheads was like, you know, I would certainly rather have the 30-year Spirit of Freedom than the Cadence 40. If you gave me a choice of those two models, I would go.
Well, Spirit of Freedom seems to be Spirit of Freedom seems to be like walking away with this competition.
The other thing that's kind of weird is it depends on like who backs the horse. Like for example, Ballantyne's was Allied de Mac, and in fact, I posted in the link. There's a book, and I used to be able to find it online as a PDF. It's like a 90-page book, purely about the history and everything you could possibly want to know about the Ballantine 17 blend, which contains some Ardbeg and some Lafroig, and it's just amazing. And when Allied got broken up, Chivas acquired them, but Chivas is like, well, you know, as long as it's making money, we'll keep it, but we're not going to like throw any money behind it.
Yeah, these are. You have to remember, the whole economy of the Scotch whiskey industry runs on blends. So, what is the commercial value? And that's where your marketers come out and actually start taking place and say, "This is the target." Why do you think Hennessy is the biggest of the cognacs in the United States? Right? They marketed it. They specifically marketed it. So yeah, it would not surprise me to have all of this done like this, and that's how they. You know what's interesting? Michael D'Souza, who was the head distiller at Paul John Distilleries in India, he said something. He framed something for me that really made sense, because in India, whiskey is known as it's what's known as IFML, Indian foreign made liquor. It's essentially molasses-based rum, and they blend in anything that they can buy from any other market in there, and then they sell it in little juice boxes, and it's the poor man's whiskey. But it's what makes their dollar. It's what makes the economy of this company, and that allows them to create a single malt. And he said, look at Sazerac. What's their biggest seller?
Buffalo Trace.
No.
Glenfarclas.
It's Fireball.
Oh,
Right.
And Fireball, Fireball allows them to make Eagle Rare and Buffalo Trace and Pappy Van Winkle. So you have to have a basis for this, right? And then it allows you to actually be creative and be on the high end and do some playing around in the super premium. But if you've got something that's like, hey, everybody, Pernod Ricard knows exactly where their money's at, and it's in Absolute and it's in Jameson. And don't ever take that away from them, because that allows them to do all the other crazy things that they want to do. So,
well, and Robin, what's crazy with blends is my understanding is that one of the earliest blends was the Chivas 25 that came over here in like the 1920s that was specifically made for the Roaring Twenties, the very affluent New York market. And my understanding is that it was even the precursor to the Chivas 12.
I don't know. Yeah.
Well, let's keep moving, and then we can come back to some of these. I did used to work in Morgantown, West Virginia for a year on a consulting project. They broke the record for the most Fireball shots in one evening. It was over 4,200. 4,200. Good Lord. Jim Albright, what was your favorite, and then what surprised you? I think you had a lot of thoughts at the beginning about blended Scotch. All of it was true. What surprised you, and what was your favorite out of tonight?
So I think I was most surprised probably by the Cabinhead's 40 year. Just on the fact that, as a lot of people said when we were tasting it, the palate kind of belied the age. It tasted a lot younger than a 40 year. For me, the nose was older than the palate, which was kind of interesting because I got a lot of leather notes, a lot of very strong. This spent a lot of time in oak notes on the nose, but those weren't so prominent on the palate. Not that it was a bad whiskey. I mean, I would drink a full pour of it right now if you poured it for me. But favorite, I hate to be a parrot, but the Spirit of Freedom was absolutely amazing. I love that heavy, viscous, oily mouthfeel that I kind of expect from Campbellton. The General, this was my first time, and I may be the only one here who's never tried the General before. That was a very, very close second. That was absolutely amazing, and that was a privilege to get to try that for the first time with you folks. So almost a coin toss between those two for what I would say was my favorite.
Definitely. I'll leave the last words for Robin, but I wanted to share that thank you all for joining. Everything's done at cost, so everything was done through auctions or whatever, so everything you paid was at cost. The General I had opened recently, but there wasn't enough, so that's why it was only half an ounce. So thank you all for accepting that. Hopefully that was enough to really enjoy. It's a desert island dram for me. It's something that I love every time I can get to it. My favorite was the Hallmark Vintage by far, because I just gotta exclude the General. It's already part of me, so I gotta exclude it. The biggest surprise was the Ainsleys, in that when I first nosed it, I was like, this sucks. This is like every old blended Scotch that I hate. And that's, Robin, that was the point of this. It was like, where are the surprises? What are all of us gonna walk away from and talk to people about the next time we talk about whiskey? And the Ainsleys, I nose it and I'm like, this sucks, because I know what to expect. But as I let it breathe, as I started to sip it, I added a little bit of water. Very good point. It really shined. It is legit. It is very legit on the mid palate and the finish. The finish for me especially was bar none, because that separated it from a lot of other old blends that I always drink. Every time you go to like a tasting, someone opens up an old blend, you're like, oh, this is awesome. You take a photo of it, you taste it, and you're like, shit, this is like the same they all taste the same like after a while. But this one on the finish definitely started to separate after a while. I mean, it takes a while. It's been in the glass for like 70 years, so it takes a while to kind of separate, but that was definitely a surprise. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. We do these, once or twice a month. We don't do this to try to make tons of money or anything. It's just break even. And it's all about sharing really, really nice drams with everybody with the story. Because there's nothing as great of drinking whiskey as hearing about it from people like Robin, and then hearing the history of where it really came from. How did they get to your glass? It's really important. It's really respectful of the industry to understand there's a lot of people involved in getting this stuff to the glass. So it's really nice. And Robin, thank you so much for your knowledge, the journey you took us on, all the time, enthusiasm you put in the slides. I'll leave you with the last words. What do you have to share with us? Oh, your favorites, what surprised you, but then also just what do you have to leave us off with as our guide throughout this journey?
Well, okay. Hey guys, this was great. It's always just wonderful to do this with everyone. I wish we could have done this live. It'd be great. But Zoom is a good, or whatever this is. I was actually, I think I was taken by the Ansleys because, first of all, it tasted the way that bottle looks. It tasted the way that bottle looked, and it does. It reminds me. I tasted history with that. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind. I tasted history with that whiskey. So that was the one that actually was my takeaway. The last thing I'm going to leave you with is actually from this book that I picked up recently, and it says this: we stand together, each with a glass of whiskey in our hand. We know its heritage, its process, and its age. But the glass is empty unless we recognize the space between us. So that's where the whiskey gets its life, its meaning, its connection to our past, and us to each other. So make your toasts, raise your glasses, and hold fast your liquid bonds that they do not evaporate into the air. So cheers, everyone.
Slanja.
It was fun.
Thank you, Robin.
Slanja.
Well, thank you all for joining. I'm going to stop the recording. We can hang out if anybody else has anything else to share. I'm sure a lot of you have questions for Robin as well. I don't know that we like to keep things on a tight pace. First, I'm going to stop